I started out as a gamer, actually. So I was watching anime as a child on TV. I myself, in the 80s, was growing up watching localized anime titles, Mysterious Cities of Gold, Ulysses 31, and these were just treated like any other cartoon, things for children. That kind of like fell to the wayside because things weren't really on TV anymore. I got into video gaming, and then it was through video gaming that I then rediscovered anime, funnily enough. One of the magazines I was buying at the time had a little section every month that covered new manga video releases. And I just remember looking at, they had a big full page picture of Battle Angel Alita. And I just remember looking at it and just something in my head, and the art for Battle Angel Alita doesn't look anything like Mysterious Cities of Gold, but somehow something just clicked in my head and was like, same thing. It wasn't so much that I rediscovered anime through the games themselves, it's more that I guess the magazine editors thought there was an overlap in the interest. That particular magazine as well also covered a lot of imported titles, so I was sort of buying this, and as someone living in a small town in Northern Ireland, and I was just like, how are they reviewing games that aren't in English? So I was sort of aware of there being video games that were adaptations of anime titles, like there was a Ranma fighting game, for example. I guess because we just didn't get the same volume of material, and I think it's the same with anime as well. There was a much greater volume of material that was available in the United States than there was in England for various reasons. One of them being, I think, that Manga Video got in very quickly and was able to kind of set its stall out and establish itself, and that became the definition of what anime was at that point. The phrase that I saw bandied about when I was writing my thesis was the beer and curry crowd. And so these were sort of, generally speaking, young men, sort of from probably mid to late teens up to late 20s, maybe even early 30s. At the weekends, be going out and drinking and spending time with their mates, and at the end of the night, they just sort of want to come home and sort of keep the party going a little bit, and it would be what's on late night TV, because late night TV in the 90s was a great source of all the weirdest stuff you can possibly imagine. And Channel 4 picked up some manga video titles, and they actually had a slot called Late License where they showed something every week, which is actually, funnily enough, how I ended up starting to watch manga video titles. Manga Video kind of was aware that that was a fan base that they could hit, and so that was the one that they focused on. And I remember seeing an interview with someone from Manga Video some years ago basically saying, if you have a hit with one thing, you keep going, and you just, the same thing over and over. So, if you've got a sci-fi hit, you don't follow it up with Riverdance, was his example. So Manga Video just sort of went, Akira, what's also like Akira? Fits the North Star, and carried on in that way. So because it was that sort of thing, and because it was being presented as this sort of cool new rock and roll thing, the trailer for Manga Video for many, many years had a punk rock song playing over the top of it, and it's one that anime fans of a certain age will remember very well because it was on every single Manga Video tape that we had. Yeah, it was sort of like a new punk rock kind of thing. So yes, I think for certain types of people there was a sense of rebellion to it, and teenagers always like to seek out things that are going to upset their parents. and Manga Video was a really, really, really easy way to do that. I mean, from my side of things, I was stubborn. I was just like, I really liked the medium, and I was sort of, on the one hand, very aware that the way that women were perceived and presented in anime titles, and particularly the anime titles that were being made available in the UK, was, very not female friendly, but kind of having to grit my teeth and go through it anyway, and just kind of like say, yeah, it's not great, but you do what you do. It wasn't until I, in the mid-90s, by chance, discovered the existence of an all-female fan club for anime fans, that I was able to actually really reach out and make contact with other female anime fans who had contacts who could get them nicer stuff, and then you could also share within the group. There was a sort of tape trading thing that went on. People would also copy like CDs for you. People knew people. This was a side of it which I was not privy to because I didn't have the connections, but there were people who were in the club who had access to other people who maybe through their university could access video materials, fan subs. Fan subs in those days were very often like 7th, 8th, 9th generation copies, and they came from you knowing someone who knew someone who knew someone who knew someone who knew someone who was at an American university and was doing their own fan subbing and could send you a copy. And you'd have to either have a video VCR that could play NTSC, or you'd have to know someone who could make the conversion to PAL. My impression of fan subs at the time, because my first boyfriend was connected and he was able to send me tapes that had been converted into PAL format, and I loved it, but I just remember thinking how colourless it all was. The first time I saw a proper video of Macross 7, I was like, oh my god, colour! very black and white for me. I joined the club and was introduced to all these things I'd never heard of and had no way of actually seeing myself. Sailor Moon, I don't think, was ever actually aired in the UK. Ranma Half, as far as I know, never in the UK, or Sayatsura. Funnily enough, a lot of the things like that I was able to watch on French TV because my dad did a weird thing with the satellite dish where he could like adjust the angle that it pointed at, and then he could watch French TV because he was learning French at the time. And I discovered if I turned on Sunday mornings, there was a whole bunch of anime. And I speak French somewhat, so I was able to follow it. But all of this stuff that I'd never heard of before, all this stuff I didn't know, and it opened up this whole new world to me. And the group, which was called Anime Babes, was set up partly to kind of provide an environment where female anime fans could make contact with each other and find each other. I'd be estimating, but maybe about 50 members, some of whom were actually in the US. I wouldn't be able to tell you the exact numbers. It ran for, I think, a year, maybe a little bit longer overall. It ended, unfortunately, because, like I say, the girls who were running it were teenagers and they were all doing their A-levels. I was like, oh, we can't really run a fanzine at the same time. The fanzine, they'd take it to conventions, and anime conventions in the UK were much, much, much smaller at that time, but nonetheless, they'd take their stuff to anime conventions and they'd sell very well. The fanzines were free to club members, but you could also purchase them if you weren't a club member, and they'd have a stand at in the dealer's room, and as I understand it, they always did very well. But also was originally intended to kind of act as a little bit of a pressure group. So the idea was to kind of have like letter writing campaigns and things, and remind the production companies, the licensing distribution companies that, hey, we're here, we'd like to have some stuff that's not all sex and violence and tentacles, please. That kind of aspect of it fell by the wayside eventually, I think, just because it would be easy to do now, but this was pre-internet, and and it was like sitting down and physically writing letters, and you can only get so much mass that way. But yeah, it ended up being actually a really good way for female fans to find each other, make contact, and to share our creative works, because there was also a fanzine with the club. They did 4 issues in the end. And there didn't seem to be like a huge editorial process or anything. The club itself was being run by other teenage girls, which I remember finding out and being amazed by, because I was just like, wait, how can these people only be like a year or two older than I am? You could send in your art, you could send in your stories. There was a good chance it would get printed and it would be in the next fanzine, and then you're sort of sharing your stuff. And this was also like I say, early days of the internet, but email addresses started becoming more commonplace, and you could share that. And there was a membership list that would include people's names and addresses, and how you could get in contact with them, and things that they were into, and things that they were willing to copy and share around. It was a sort of very lo-fi, very classically how fandoms operate. It was a really good force for, I think, at the very least, making people aware of what else was out there. And then as it was, Pokemon came along, because that was a massive phenomenon, and that by itself also then caused massive changes in how the fandom looked. I like to horrify newer anime fans by telling them that the first convention I went to, the Masquerade, was half an hour long. There were 12 entrants, and it started and ended on time. My first convention was in 1997. I was in the Masquerade. My mum came with me because I was under 16 and had to have a parent with me. And so she filmed me being in the Masquerade, and it was just like, I think she may have actually filmed the entire thing. It's a funny thing in the UK. There is a very distinct difference between fan-run anime conventions that are usually held in hotels if they're very small, like Minamicon, or maybe on a university campus if they're slightly larger, like Amicon, Iacon, and then the much more kind of corporate-oriented things like MCM Comic-Con. The way that the fan-run cons have operated has changed because they no longer have video rooms, for example, and part of that is because back in the day it relied on fan subs, and this is now legally questionable, especially when you have people who are attending conventions as fans, but who also in some capacity or another work in the industry.
Plus you can just get everything now.
Yeah, that as well. It's no longer like such an event to go to a con and watch a new release. I remember being at Iacon, I think it was in the late 90s, when someone literally was like, as the con was going on, was landing on a plane with a US release of like the latest Evangelion movie and was escorting it to the hotel so that they could show it on the Saturday night, But yeah, it's no longer an event to kind of like go to an anime con and know that they're going to screen something and that's going to be a thing, because you can get it so easily. You can through Crunchyroll, through more dubious places if you're not paying for Crunchyroll, and also, like I say, the being able to have the sort of cooperation of the actual companies that are releasing means it's not really viable to have video rooms anymore. Instead, you have the smaller anime cons. It's become much more of like a sort of like a festival of fandom almost, and because all the events are largely run by volunteers who are from the attendees rather than from the committee. Kind of a different beast in that way. Whereas if you go to London Film and Comic Con or MCM or any of those, they are primarily about, we have guests, we have panels, we also have all the sellers, all the traders in the world, and we have things like cosplay and stuff where we'll have sort of big competitions, and whereas they have semi-competitive cosplay at the fan run cons, but they tend to be either it is not competitive at all, or it is competitive but the prizes are silly and made up on the spot, or there is something maybe a little bit closer to the American model of you sign up for the competition and you go to be judged privately, and then they'll announce winners at the end, but that's the thing you have to opt into. There was a case in the early 2000s where there was a girl who went to an anime con, and she was first anime con, first cosplay, her costume was beautiful, she won a prize for it. And afterwards, someone started sending her nasty messages because they thought that she wasn't deserving. And she went on to the big anime forum in the UK at the time was Anime Europe, and she went on there and was like, oh, I had a great time, I was really happy to win, but I never want to win anything again because the aftermath has been so unpleasant. And the response from anime cons that were running at the time was, we're worried that we're actually getting too American. People are taking it too seriously. We just want people to have fun with this. So no more competitive cosplay, which I myself was actually kind of annoyed about because I liked the competitive element to it, and I was just like, you could just make it optional, but there was a very deliberate kind of, we don't want to be like the American scene because, again, early days of the internet, but people were sort of seeing how things were operating in the much larger US fandoms and feeling like it wasn't quite as friendly and welcoming. And when in the UK anime fan scene, it's so tight-knit and so many people know each other, especially at that time. We were kind of all circulating in the same places and we were sort of seeing all the same faces at the conventions. So we kind of, broadly speaking, all knew each other, and it felt more kind of like a close community. And then it was just like, oh, this feels like a threat to the community. So that's kind of a bad thing, that we want to actively move away from that. It's changed because people have become much more aware of how things work in the US, and it's much easier now if you are living in the UK to go to a US con. British people do go to US cons and kind of know how that works. And there are people who can go to the big con. There's I can't remember if it's called Anime Expo, but there's one in Paris, which Paris Expo is very easy to get to if you're on the Eurostar, and some people have even been able to go to Japan for it, and things like this are much easier now than they once were. So I think people kind of just go see what it's like in other places and then bring that back. That naturally kind of then ends up bleeding into the overall culture. The thing that is incredible in the UK anime fandom is how Minami-Con, broadly speaking, has not changed very much. It's the longest running fan run anime con in the UK, and it's, aside from it has changed the venue once. First 2 years it was in Portsmouth, and ever since then it's been in Southampton, and it's been in the same place. Its numbers, like its membership number, has not really changed. It's the same sorts of people who are going. And again, the only thing that has really changed over the years is that they no longer have a video program. And instead, they have a big kind of like festival in with food and games and stuff. And other than that, it kind of operates like a little old-fashioned anime con, and it's quite nice in that way. At the time, there was actually quite a lot of negative sentiment about Japan, particularly in the press. There have been studies done by sociologists in various other universities that have actually actively analysed the sentiment attached to news stories related to things in Japan, and broadly quite negative. There was a turning point at some point, and I think probably it's a post-war thing, because prior to the First and Second World Wars, there was quite a lot of very positive sentiment about Japan. The British people were quite fascinated with things to do with Japan, particularly Japanese art, and you can see in terms of the responses to the collections of Japanese art that were at the World's Fair in the late 1800s, and the popularity of the Mikado, which was strongly inspired by Japan, possibly because it was an Axis power. After the Second World War, there was this enormous anti-Japanese sentiment. Maybe not to the same degree. There wasn't a yellow peril in the UK the same way that there was in, for example, the US. But nonetheless, people did seem to sort of start to feel a little bit antagonistic about things to do with Japan. And a lot of the press at the time, it focused on things like whaling culture. There was the Sumitomo scandal, in a way that handled the Japanese as being sort of strange and operating on a different level in a way that doesn't make sense to British people. And there would be things like comparisons between how the Japanese imperial royal family operated and how the British royal family was operating. And generally speaking, it was like, they're not like us. When Manga Video started releasing stuff, I guess it was kind of already primed to respond in a somewhat negative way. Although having said that, something that is interesting is that the response to anime as being negative was not immediate. Yes, a lot of people think of Akira as being the flashpoint for anime in the UK, but anime had been seen in the UK since the 50s, and generally speaking, had been responded to fairly neutrally. Early anime screenings at the London Film Festival, again from the 1950s onwards, tended to be fairly... They might be commented on in the way that they'd be compared to Disney, but otherwise without any real value judgments attached. Once Manga Video started releasing things, and because Akira was successful and they started looking for other things that would hit the same notes, and unfortunately that meant the very sort of very violent science fiction, fantasy, horror. So it sort of formed this negative opinion of the medium as a whole. In a bit of unfortunate timing, there was a resurgence of the video nasties scare from the 80s. In the early 90s, there was a fairly notorious case of a little boy named James Bulger who was abducted by two 10-year-old boys, taken away from his mother, walked long distance, and was then brutally murdered. When it came out that the murderers were these two boys, people went searching for answers, and the tabloid press in particular started looking at the home life and established that the father of one of the two boys was really into renting horror films from his video shop. And it's important to understand the concept of the video shop in the UK as being distinct from something like a Blockbuster. There was a video shop in my hometown which was also it was a little store that was on a petrol station. Snacks, cigarettes, booze, and yes, very often they'd have a selection of videos. And, for a long time in my hometown, that was the place where you went if you wanted to rent videos. And they had all kinds. They did have stuff for children, but they were also tended to be the place that were associated with weird horror films. Basically what happened was the tabloids discovered that the father of this boy was really into renting horror films. They went through his recent rentals and homed in on Child's Play 3. Of all things. And there was a bunch of mythology that came out in the press about, the parallels between the way that they defeat Chucky in that film and how they murdered James kind of thing, and none of which was true. It then sort of ended up whipping up this kind of, another moral panic, and it was just the video nasty scare all over again. There was a proposed act of parliament that would have basically outlawed any kind of video anywhere. The wording was so vague that it would have just basically meant that the BBFC, the British Board of Film Classification, would have had the power to watch a film and then basically say, we are going to certify it, but it's going to have a certification that says it's not suitable for public performance anywhere, or not suitable for performance anywhere. And again, it's one of those protects the children kind of things. If they refuse to give a certificate to something, that effectively bans it. So they don't actually have the legal right to ban, but they can say we will not give the certificate, and that functionally bans it. I don't know that it ever really had much of a chance of going through. It didn't in the end, but it was one of those things where it's sort of something needs to be done. The tabloid press then was feeding off that as well, and it was sort of absorbing all these other controversial titles, things that could be banned under this new act. Even though there was no anime title that was actually mentioned by anyone in a political context, it sort of got whipped up into it as well, because Manga Video was sort of just releasing things. I think they had probably just, or had relatively recently released Legend of the Overfiend. Someone approached, it was a journalist for the Daily Star, a guy by the name of Ken Sen-Gupta, who has since gone on to be a much less ridiculous journalist. He's a political editor for The Independent or something now, I think. But he went to the MP who was proposing the Act of Parliament. Look at this stuff, this Japanese stuff. What do you think of this? And this is at the same time. And his response to it was to basically say, oh yes, no, also horrifying, absolutely terrible, should be banned. And then you get this headline in the Daily Star that snuff out these sick cartoons, with these sort of salacious pictures from... The thing is, it wasn't even Legend of the Overfiend. I think it was Wicked City, actually. But there was, for quite a long time, this sort of feeling of, it's all this sort of sex and violence and hardcore, and, cartoons aren't for children anymore, and this is a thing that you are still seeing people saying to this day. And it's just like, cartoons, when you look at the history of animation, have often very much not been for children. I actually had this conversation with my family very recently. My dad just sort of reminded us of the existence of an old Bugs Bunny cartoon, in which there was this sort of busty female rabbit who was like, large kiss me, big boy. And it was like, oh, it's a strange thing to have in a children's cartoon. And I was just like, well, let me explain a thing to you. I remember myself when I was in my teens and sort of getting into anime and just sort of beginning to reach out and find other anime fans, and coming up against people who were in my classmates, in fact, who were sort of, oh, it's all sex and violence and horrible stuff. And I was just like, it really isn't. And none of you are watching it, so none of you know. And that was the kind of general feeling that you were coming up against at the time if you were an anime fan. So there was, if you were an anime fan in the 90s in the UK, you kind of always had to be on your back foot, and you were kind of having to go into things naturally defensive because people tended to attack rather than actually investigate for themselves. with the BBFC, it was a combination of it being so different to anything that they'd seen before, because, for sure, animation for adults was not an unfamiliar thing. There had been examples in the 70s, Ralph Bakshi's work in particular. Anime was just a whole new, different ballgame. So I think there was a certain sense of kind of bewilderment with the BBFC, combined with the fact that the then, I think, Director General probably, the guy who was the head of the BBFC, he was, I think, very keen to stay on side with the government, and because the government was getting whipped up about video nasties and stuff, and so he kind of decided he was going to run with that. So that meant being abjectly horrified at the things that Manga Video was trying to release, and which again, like I say, Manga Video was then sort of saying, oh well, here are the bits we had to cut out and putting it in the press releases so people would talk about it. But it is quite fascinating to look at the annual reports that the BBFC released at the time, and just sort of specifically to go through and look for any references to Asian cinema broadly and Japanese animation in specifically. There's always this this horrifying trend of these violent cartoons coming from Japan, and the exact phrasing is incredible. You can find the reports online, and I did also quote them, I think, quite a lot in my thesis. And it's just astonishing. They just didn't know what to do with it, and so they just reacted with horror. As I understand it, I don't know all the exact ins and outs of how the BBFC operates, but I gather that they're kind of assessment panels. They are trained to do the assessments before certificates are awarded, but they are kind of drawn from everyday life, and so some of the people there would have been parents, and they quite possibly would have been looking at it as oh, this isn't like a Bugs Bunny cartoon that I'd let my children watch, this is horrifying. Right. 18.
You just had shocked school moms and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, they wouldn't all have been, but probably there was a significant contingent that were. Protect the children is a really easy thing to run with if you're trying to stir up a moral panic. So, I mean, I just remember the first Minami-Con that I went to after Pokemon had started in the UK, and Cardcaptor Sakura as well was also actually quite a big force for this, and it sort of gets overlooked because Pokemon is such a huge thing and still is. But
was this the Nelvana dub, the Cardcaptors dub?
I believe so, yes. I remember sitting in the foyer in the hotel and looking at the queue of people. I can't remember if they were there to register or if they were waiting to get into the dealer's room, but I just remember looking at them and thinking, there are so many more younger people, and there are so many more girls and feminine people, and more people with funny coloured hair and such, so it seemed like very quickly things were more diverse. When I was doing my research, I looked into the demographics of anime fandom, and it wasn't just sort of I didn't just sort of do a male-female split. It was also other gender identities, and I also asked about sexual orientation, and I asked about what entry points there were and so on. And something that sort of came out of that was that as time has gone on, there has been, it's become racially more diverse. It's become, in terms of gender identity and also in terms of sexual orientation, a lot more diverse. Something that I didn't track for, but which it seems to be kind of true based on my own experience, and also just from feedback that I've had from people following when I've done talks about my research, is an awful lot of neurodivergent people, and very particularly people who are autistic, ADHD, or indeed a combination of the two, which is what I have. And I couldn't really sort of with absolute certainty say, why is it that the autistic kids and the ADHD kids and the people who have a bit of both or who have other neurodivergencies really gravitate towards anime? One of the theories that I've heard is that because it's animated, everything is much bigger, and facial expressions, it's much easier to tell when a character is experiencing a certain emotion when it's animated. And if you're autistic and you have trouble reading facial expressions and cues, that's really easy. You can tell exactly what's going on, and you don't have to sit there doing a whole bunch of decoding to try and make sure that you're making sense of it. Like I say, that's just a theory that I've heard, but it does kind of make sense to me. I'm not quite sure why queer people like anime, and it's not to say all queer people like anime, but an awful lot of anime fans are also queer, and I do wonder if again there's a sort of sense of rebelliousness and a sense of going against the norm, because if you are any flavour of queer, if you are transgender or non-binary, or you're anything that's not cisgender heterosexual, you're kind of setting yourself against the grain, and especially if you also then are neurodivergent, which an awful lot of queer people who are also anime fans are, funnily enough. So you're kind of embracing a thing that is different because you are different, and then you can find all these other people who are also different like you, and it's been very well documented in science fiction. There's a book called Neurotribes, which interviewed a science fiction fan, specifically a Star Trek fan, who was autistic and said that she very particularly found a sort of sense of kinship with Dr. Spock, because the way Dr. Spock's character operates is very different, but if you're autistic, you maybe see a lot of overlaps in that. And the fact that anime can have characters who can be so weird and different, and there's like these incredible things that are happening around them, and it's sort of comprehensible in the way that you can read the expressions. Everything is very clear. It's a different kind of escapism, I think. It's you sort of being able to see something like you, different from the norm, and being able to kind of feel like that lets you feel like you're normal for a little bit. Based on my research, I'm actually the third generation of anime fans in the UK.
Oh.
When I did my research, I like I say, I asked people about entry points and identified different entry points along the way. And actually, the very first generation were people who were watching Marine Boy on TV in the 60s.
Right,
yeah. So by the time I was getting into anime, I was sort of into what I think I called the hybrid generation, because we were getting interested through the hybrid productions, things like Mysterious Cities of Gold. In terms of why so many of us have stuck around, from my side of things, it's just stubbornness. I mean, as someone who was diagnosed late with ADHD as well, like it's sort of something that you learn to do is to sort of assess what has stuck around, because things can be so fleeting in your life. And anime is one of those things which has just, I've never lost interest in it. And that has kind of stuck around. There may be facets about the fandom that I've sort of gradually moved in and out of, and maybe I'm not so interested in going to conventions anymore because it's gotten expensive and time consuming, and there are other things that I can do now to express my fandom that don't involve all the time and expense that are involved in going to an anime con. And a lot of people as well have just found that it was, particularly when they were younger and they were using it to experiment with producing art and doing writing and things like that, and it's just been a way for them to continue expressing themselves artistically. The fact that as a medium it has not gone away and probably will never go away, there is always material there, and especially as well, I think as more recent titles have done better with embracing alternative sexualities and alternative gender identities, and it's so much easier now to get hold of the stuff that isn't all sex, violence, tentacles, and that makes up such a minor part of it as a whole now, and especially with things like Crunchyroll making it so easy to get high quality subtitled very soon after it's shown in Japan. It's still very easy to indulge in it. If it continued to be as difficult to obtain as it was when we were teenagers and had all the time in the world, I think possibly it wouldn't have persisted quite as long, but it's just, as we've grown up, it's become easier. And I think myself about, like, if I was to go back in time and meet my 16-year-old self and say, one day you'll be able to have a computer and you'll be able to go on the computer and watch anime the same way that you watch any other cartoon on TV. That would have been incredible to me. And I think possibly to an extent for people who are of my generation, seeing how that has changed and how it has become so much easier to get. It's just really nice to still be a part of, and because it's so easy to keep that going. And if you are nostalgic a little bit, nostalgic for a childhood that you maybe didn't necessarily have, it's nice to kind of have that to hold on to, but also to see it sort of grow and evolve with you.